from PISM, our Polish sister institute. And last speaker is Ståle Ulriksen, who is senior researcher at NUPI, but mainly at Navy Defense College in Bergen. So, with no further ado, I think I'll invite Jens to start. I hope he'll be provocative, and so we can get a good discussion. And of course, we will have Q&A afterwards, about 15 minutes each presentation, and then Q&A from here. Jens, please.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me up here and speaking on this subject that I think is timely. I think that over the last couple of years, we've heard a new word, or an old word in NATO, deterrence. Deterrence is back. It came back with Wales, and suddenly it's really the come in vogue in NATO. I will talk about the VJTF primarily, and the so-called enhanced NRF, the very high readiness joint task force of VJTF and the NATO response force. But I'll start out with an anecdote, a personal anecdote, which I think to some extent encapsulates different ways of thinking about deterrence, different ways of perceiving deterrence within NATO. 9 years ago, I defended my PhD dissertation, and my dissertation was on Denmark and NATO and the role of Denmark within NATO, and it was on how little Denmark really spent on defense during the Cold War, primarily, because Denmark really spent very little. We spent actually as little as we could, because in Denmark, policymakers thought that, well, Danish armed forces didn't really make a difference in terms of Danish security. What really mattered were American security guarantees. You can like it or not, but that was the way Denmark perceived of security during the Cold War, and to some extent today as well. But on my PhD committee, there was a brilliant, prominent, and prolific Norwegian professor, Ståle. And Ståle was, in his intervention, he said something along the lines like, well, in northern Norway, we could actually, we could stop the Russians for 2 weeks, and then reinforcement would come to Norway. And I don't know if that is true or not. I have no idea. And it doesn't matter, because the point here is that the Danish audience, they were colleagues of mine, friends of mine, they were smiling. And afterwards, they came to me, I never told you this story, but they came to me and said, 2 weeks, no way, a small state like Norway, it's like Denmark, it's impossible. So I think it tells you about something about strategic cultures and strategic culture, whether, I think in Norway it would be fair to say that there's been this belief that you could actually defend yourself, at least for a while, against Russia, while in Denmark there was no such illusions. Everyone thought the only thing giving us security is American deterrence. And I think there traces a remnants of that thinking. We see it again today in the debate about NATO deterrence. And I think we'll come back to that later. But what I'll do now is, for the next 13 minutes or so, I'll speak about the so-called enhanced NRF and the VJTF, and whether these new instruments, whether they can actually deter Russia. Are they credible? To assess whether they are or not, I think we need to look at capacity, doctrine, and culture. And my argument would be that it's not enough to deter Russia if you think of deterrence as deterrence by denial. But if you think of it as deterrence by punishment, then it might just be enough. Because and that would be my main argument, what the VJTF really is a tripwire force. It's really similar to what I think during the Cold War was called the AML, the Allied Mobile Force Land, small force, brigade size, multinational, and I think the VJTF is really similar to that. And that was a classical tripwire force linked to deterrence by punishment. NATO can and will not do deterrence by denial. So therefore, NATO should prepare for deterrence by punishment, which is difficult and politically perhaps inconvenient. And then finally a look towards Warsaw and what will come, my guess, would come out of that. So you've all been told that at Wales, NATO decided to enhance the NRF. And I think your former Prime Minister talked about the biggest reinforcement of collective defense since the end of the Cold War. Well, that's an easy one because there was no reinforcement of collective defense since the Cold War. So it's true, but let's have a look at how much the VJTF and the NRF was actually enhanced. I think it would be fair to say that what was added at Wales was more readiness, because the old NRF had it could be deployed within 30 days, or 45 days, actually, I think. 30 or 45 days. 30 days. It has added very little new muscle. There are more exercises, snap exercises, there are more inspections of the NRF and the VJTF. The VJTF is part of the NRF, but there's added very little new muscles. And that has to do, so the question then of course is, how can Stoltenberg talk about going from 13,000 troops to 40,000 troops? And there's a bit of a creative book keeping here, because the old NRF, before Wales, had a spearhead force within it called the Immediate Response Force. The Immediate Response Force consisted of 13,000 troops. But there were always 13,000 troops standing up before they were going on standby, and there was 30,000 troops standing down. What they did at Wales was that, well, why don't we just add those 13,000 troops standing up and the 13,000 troops standing down? Then we will enhance it. Whoopty, we have 39,000 troops. So that's why it's now up to 30 or 40,000 troops. There's no, in my mind, there's been done very little to actually strengthen the NRF. But as I said, they added more readiness. But the standing up forces and the standing down forces, together, they are now labeled the Initial Follow-On Forces Group, IFFG. They have a readiness of 45 days. They can be deployed in 45 days. That is not high readiness. That is not a force that can be deployed quickly. But fair to say, there's been more training, more snap exercises. So the second thing, aside from capacity, is doctrine, the second dimension of deterrence. And in some way, you can make a distinction between two ways of deterrence. Deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment, two different kinds of logic. Deterrence by denial is basically rooted in the thinking that you can, to some extent, persuade an opponent not to attack because you're too strong. You can actually defend yourself, you can dig in as in northern Norway, and then you can fight, and then they will give up even before they try, right? So the opponent is persuaded that NATO is simply too strong and can deny access. What that requires is a very strong, potent, forward-deployed force. And that is not the VJTF. The VJTF is brigade size. It would never stop a Russian attack. So NATO does not have the forces right now forwardly deployed to be able to do deterrence by denial. So what is left is the politically less convenient option of deterrence by punishment. And I think that is really how most of NATO nations think of the VJTF, as a tripwire force, as a force, a multinational force, and you need to make sure that there are Americans and Brits and French within that force, because what their job is to die on day one. You need to make sure that there are flags on the coffins. You need to make sure that there are stars and stripes on the coffins. Because if the Russians know that there are American flags on the coffins day one, that will persuade them not to attack. Because it will be linked to punishment. It will be linked to a conventional and or nuclear response towards something in Russia. They need to believe that. We need to make sure that they believe that. That is the only way that you can do deterrence by punishment, and that is what the VJTF is really there for, as I see it. Of course, it's a painful question within NATO. Should we, and it has to do with NATO's posture, how much conventional forces, how much nuclear forces, how much nuclear capability? And that is unclear, that is ambiguous. And to some extent, that is actually an advantage for NATO, keeping it ambiguous. The third dimension that has to do with deterrence is culture. Because to deter someone, you need to have a reputation for resolve. And building up a reputation for resolve implies several things. First of all, you need a fitting, adequate decision-making culture. What that means for NATO right now, it means that you need, first of all, speed. Because if something is going to happen in the East, you need to be able to react very, very quickly. Of course, you can put up early warning systems, indicators, as NATO is doing right now, increase intelligence capabilities. You can have, but you can also have, even before an attack, you can have SACEUR putting together a force, being ready, just waiting for nations to give the go-ahead. But at the end of the day, what you need is national fast-track procedures. You need national governments, and you need, in some places, in some countries, parliaments making these decisions very, very fast. And it's not only to do with mobilizing your force, it has also to do with giving, allowing other nations to transit through your territory with military equipment. That is a real issue in Germany. Then you also need credibility. You need, as an alliance, to keep all options on the table. You cannot tell your opponent that there's something you will do and something you cannot do, or will not do. And you also need to identify some red lines. You need to yourself decide, these are things that we will not accept. This is unacceptable. But you should not detail those red lines too much to your opponent, because you want to keep your opponent guessing. So your opponent should be unsure whether you will actually strike on him with your big hammer if he sends small green men in, or how much is it that, how much will it take? So that has to do with credibility. And I think NATO needs to work on these things for NATO to become, once again, really good at doing deterrence, and doing deterrence by punishment. I think that debate will play out at Warsaw, perhaps not as explicit as I put it up here, but implicitly we will have that debate. Then, of course, at Warsaw, I think we will have a debate between those countries arguing RAP 1, what we decided at Wales was good, it worked. Just see, the Russians didn't go into the Baltic countries, or Norway, or Poland, or elsewhere. So we don't need to invest more in a RAP 2, or invest more in the VJTF, or even more enhanced NRF. And then on the other hand, there will be nations arguing, we need to do more. I think Norway will be one of those nations, the Baltic states, of course, Poland. And probably there'll be some sort of compromise, as always in NATO, but I think that compromise will probably be closer to RAP 1 than RAP 2, because the major powers within NATO, they don't see Russia as a major threat. They see Russia as something that could be dealt with by deterrence by punishment, and that Russia is being deterred right now. And then there'll be a debate about how can we reinvent the old Harmel formula by, on the one hand, doing deterrence, but at the same time reaching out and having a dialogue. And of course, some nations will argue that we need to stand firm and balance or tilt towards deterrence, and you'll have other nations, mainly from the south, but also from some West European countries, arguing that we should go more in the direction of dialogue. How that will play out will also, to some extent, be determined by how things will play out in the EU. The EU is going to decide whether to renew sanctions towards Russia this summer, and some nations are now openly talking about loosening those sanctions. So if you go back on sanctions, then probably you'll also see less deterrence and more dialogue. But then again, there's someone here from Warsaw who will probably know a lot more about this. So with those words, I think I will stop here.
Thank you, Jens. Perfect. On timing as well, yes. It's not always so easy with academics to, when they stick to time. That's perfect. Wojciech, the floor is yours. The perspective directly from Poland.
Thank you very much, Karsten. Thank you. Welcome. My name is Wojciech Lorenz. I am a senior analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and I will try to give you my perspective on what is going on and whether the decisions taken during the Wales Summit in 2014 and their implementations enhance our deterrence. But first of all, I would like to give you the strategic outlook, where we are, what has happened when Russia annexed Crimea and fueled internal war in eastern Ukraine. We all know that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia lost around 50% of its demographic potential. It lost 14 republics, 3 of which joined NATO, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But it also lost the buffer zone, which was formed by the former Warsaw Pact countries. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we lived in this reality that, okay, now Europe is whole and free, we need to overcome the decisions. There were some decisions taken that the former Warsaw Pact countries, with Poland as the biggest of them, will be the members of first NATO and then European Union. Although it was a very difficult process, it wasn't that easy to get into NATO. We really had to work hard, and we had to convince our partners in the West that we are a part of the Western world, and that the NATO enlargement will not provoke Russia. So there was this agreement that, okay, we build a common security space. There will be NATO enlargement, but it will be mainly or solely political, not in the military sense. And this was the fact that to have the NATO enlargement, first we had to, or NATO had to agree this NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997. First it was agreed during the summit, and NATO summit. It was signed, and only a couple of months later, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary were invited to NATO. So without this agreement, without this assurance that, okay, we enlarge NATO, but we are not doing this against Russia, but we want to build a common security space, a number of Western countries would not agree on NATO enlargement. And it had some consequences. As I said, enlargement was mainly political, so there was no infrastructure, or at least no meaningful infrastructure on the new territories, on the territories of the new member states, because Russia was a partner, not an enemy or rival or even prospective enemy. Everybody was determined to develop the cooperation with Russia. So even if the border states had their security calculations or their phobias, there was always the argument within NATO that Russia is a partner and we will not strengthen any defense on the eastern flank because it could be perceived as provocative. And we had this state until 2014, when Russia violated all the agreements that were the foundation of this security architecture. And the message is clear that Russia does not approve of the post-Cold War status quo, that it perceives this power distribution as unfavorable for its interests, and it communicates openly that it would like to have the new security architecture in Europe, where it perceives major pillars of the security architecture. European Union, which was shown in the situation where Ukraine tried to sign the association agreement with EU, where it also perceives NATO as the major threat for its long-term survival. So this is the strategic situation, that Russia openly communicates that it wants the new security architecture, that it perceives NATO and EU as a threat for its survival, that it will not accept any kind of integration of the post-Soviet space with transatlantic, or from our perspective, Western structures. And obviously we don't know what else can Russia do to pursue its interests if we see that this region is pretty vulnerable. So I would come down to this baseline that if Russia wants the new security architecture and it perceives NATO and EU as a major threat, NATO is officially written in Russian security or doctrine as the threat. So we need to take seriously the possibility that Russia would try to undermine NATO's credibility by doing some kind of scenario, for example, in the Baltic states. So this is the answer for some arguments that we hear from time to time, whether we believe that Russian tanks will roll through European plains or something. No, I don't believe that Russian tanks will roll through Poland or Germany. But we need to seriously take this scenario that Russia will try to exploit some vulnerabilities in our defense posture here in the region. But the reality is still, as I said at the very beginning, that in NATO there is no compromise on how far we should go with strengthening the eastern border, the eastern NATO flank. And there is the compromise that we still stick to this 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, which says that NATO will not deploy a significant combat military troops on the territory of the new member states. There are different estimates what it means, significant combat troops. In the 90s, military people usually dealt with divisions, like 3 brigades. So it was a significant combat unit. These days, a significant combat unit can be a brigade or 2 brigades. And after all those changes that we could see in our security environment, NATO decided to respond first to reassure allies here in the eastern flank. And there were some reassurance measures, but I say it's very important to understand what reassurance means. It does not have any deterrence value. It is not to show Russia that we are able to defend those countries, because reassurance measures, they mean that, for example, Baltic air policing mission, which usually consists of 4 aircraft, usually unarmed, it was augmented and it was strengthened to 16 aircraft, which is not that big, but this is a signal mainly for those countries that NATO allies are with you, and if needs be, we will support you. Then we had also more exercises in the region, which is pretty important because it provided this temporary tripwire. Jens mentioned that there are allied troops present in the Baltic states or in Poland, and they could trigger off the automatic NATO reaction if Russia miscalculated and decided to go with one of those scenarios aimed at compromising NATO. But I would like to focus on the longer-term adaptation measures because they are more important, and this is what all the debate in NATO ahead of the Warsaw Summit is about. This is how to strengthen the region in a meaningful way, how to send a signal to Russia that we will defend the region. So how to deter Russia. We don't have too much time, so very briefly I will also just mention that after or together with annexation of Crimea and Russian activities in eastern Ukraine, Russia started a number of provocative activities along NATO borders, and you all are probably well aware of all those exercises with some nuclear attacks. But the biggest thing is that Russia demonstrates that it has completely new army. It is different than during the Cold War, where you really had the strategic warning, because if you wanted to perform a conventional attack, you had to mobilize your army. It took weeks, if not months. And at those days, NATO was pretty confident that it would be able to see that Russia is mobilizing forces, so okay, they are preparing something. These days, they introduced the reform to their army, and they have almost 1 million strong army that is in constant readiness. They are able to mobilize more than 100,000 troops just close to Baltic states within 3 days. They are performing so-called snap exercises, so we don't know if those exercises with 50,000 troops, they will be changed into offensive operation within hours or not. And this is completely different than during the Cold Wars. We don't have time for the reaction. If they wanted to go off with the offensive scenario, they could go for it within hours, and we would have no time to react. So NATO introduced some improvements in this defense posture that I tried to outline. VJTF that Jens briefed you on is actually the only operational thing. This is the only combat unit that NATO would be able to deploy quickly. This is 1 brigade. Russia is able to mobilize the equivalent of 40 brigades very quickly. Then we are talking about the enhanced NATO reaction forces, NRF. So we could have this up to 40,000 strong units. Pretty important element of the decisions that were taken is just enhancing the readiness level of multinational corps Northeast, which is based in Szczecin. NATO has 9 corps, and 8 of them placed in old NATO member states. The only one placed here in Szczecin was also the only one that was low readiness. So it was another signal that, okay, we don't expect any kind of threat from the east. So the only corps that we have on the territory of the new member state is low readiness. So it means that its time for reaction is up to 180 days. And in Wales, NATO decided that it will be also a high readiness headquarter. It means that it should be ready to operate up to 90 days. Another significant thing was that the personnel in this headquarters will be increased from 200 to 400 soldiers. And from the perspective of the new member states, from the perspective of Poland, it is important that more and more NATO representatives are delegating their officers to this headquarters. So after annexation of Crimea, the number of countries present in Szczecin in this headquarter have grown from 13 to 21. It is still not 28 for 28 principle, which is pretty important, but it is improving. So we have VJTF, which would be able to which we could deploy pretty quickly within days to the threatened region. We have improved command and control by raising the readiness of this multinational core Northeast headquarters. They will achieve the full operational capability only in 2018. This means that they will be able to command joint operations with land, air, and naval elements only in 2018 after many certifications and improvements. Another thing that is pretty important, that NATO established so-called NATO force integration units. Very small, 40% strong elements, 40 people in Poland, 40 people in Romania, Bulgaria, and Baltic states in each of the country that will be responsible for coordinating the deployment of this very high readiness joint task force of this VJTF. This is very important that by creating NATO, by creating this VJTF, NATO had to overcome many obstacles, practical obstacles, how to deploy this brigade quickly. So they had to improve the decision-making process in NATO headquarters, and it has been done. It is still not perfect, and we don't know whether it would be possible to make the decision within hours, but at least we know that they are able to do this within 1 or 2 days. So this decision-making process was improved, but they also had to improve the command structure elements and infrastructure to be able to deploy this small unit pretty fast. And it is being done. Those NFIUs, the acronym again, NATO Force Integration Units, they are so-called in the interim operational mode now. It means that the national countries provided the personnel. Usually 20 people will come from the nation states and 20 more will come from the allies. Now those international slots are being filled as we speak. Another pretty important thing that was approved during Wales Summit was the decision to strengthen the exercises. Previously, we couldn't convince our allies that, okay, Russia is our partner, but it wouldn't harm to perform the Article 5 scenario exercises from time to time. The argument was, we don't need Article 5 exercises because there is no threat. So actually, NATO was unwilling to check whether it would be able to perform any territorial defense operation on the eastern flank. After the Crimea, there is the consensus that we need such exercises, and they are performed. I would just point into 3 exercises, pretty important, out of 300 that took place in 2015. It is Noble Jump 2015, which trained the deployment of this VJTF to Poland, and it showed that, okay, we are able to deploy this spearhead, or whatever we call it, this very high reaction force within days. Another exercise that is worth mentioning is swift response. So allies trained in the south the airborne operation, which was to show that we are able to operate in the contested area. For example, although it was not held neither in Poland nor in the Baltic states, we need to face the risk of Russian air and missile defense systems that would block NATO access to the region. So the exercises showed that NATO is able to operate in this kind of environment. It is able to move some airborne troops and get, for example, the airport, and it will be able to provide some reinforcements. And very important exercise was a Trident Juncture, which was the training of the VJTF for this year, the VJTF which is on standby this year, 2016. It took place in Spain and Portugal and Italy. There were more than 35,000 troops involved, and it showed that NATO is able to perform a large-scale defensive operation. From this sense, it had not only, from this perspective, it had not only operational sense, but it was also the messaging towards Russia that we are able to deliver on those small steps that we are introducing, but we are going to deliver. Coming to an end, I would say that there have been a number of improvements. If we look at the reality, what we had before the annexation of Crimea, and this idealistic vision, very tempting, that we will be able to build some common space with Russia, but now it turns out that Russia does not want to build this common space, that it perceives NATO, EU, and any kind of institutional presence in the region as a threat. We need to come to the conclusion that NATO probably did what it could with the capacity that it has. I mean that after decades of cuts, after the removal of conventional armored troops, with the removal of tactical nuclear weapons from Europe, NATO is trying to readjust, but we need to be realistic about it, and we need to know what is the money, what is the political will, and from this perspective, I would say that the decision taken and the implementation is okay on the positive side. Whether it will be enough to deter Russia, if it is on their agenda to compromise NATO, I would say probably no. Without further moves and further messaging, I would say that, and this will be the question that will be asked during the next seminar, but if you see that Russia may calculate that it is worth to achieve a strategic gain and just to enforce the collapse of the whole security infrastructure and to enforce the building the new relations with NATO, probably those countries would stay theoretically in NATO, but it would be more or less officially a Russian buffer zone, because if they went into the offensive operation and NATO would be unable to regain the lost territory in the Baltic states, it would mean that NATO would again coalesce around the old member states, but those states would be very, very vulnerable. It would have a huge strategic consequences, and this is one thing that we try to message ahead of the NATO summit, that this scenario will be in short term tragic for this region, for the new member states, but in the longer term it will also be strategically very negative for the Western Europe. So if we are talking about the deterrence, there are three elements I would mention that can contribute to the meaningful, credible deterrence. The first is that the probability that NATO will be involved, so this 28 for 28 principle, and it is going pretty well, because when we are building VJTF, so all 28 states are trying to contribute. If we are setting up those multinational command and control elements, all states are contributing. So this is the message that, okay, if something happens, we all will be involved. Another element is the ability to mount a counteroffensive. If we think about this black case scenario, NATO would have some limited ability to mount a counteroffensive with this VJTF and a RAF, but it will need to to rebuild the follow-on forces, the bigger forces. There are some decisions being taken, but if you know what scale it is to rebuild a number of divisions that will have heavy armor, it will take years and billions of euros. And whether it will be possible to do this in the current situation where we also have huge threats from the south and huge challenges from the south, it is difficult to say. The third point is that NATO also needs to have the ability to escalate at all levels up to the nuclear level. And this is one thing that is also very important, because Russia can calculate, okay, we will go with this scenario because we are ready to escalate, and we send those messages. We've been sending them for years now, that we are even ready to use tactical nuclear weapons. So NATO will give up. They don't have those weapons, they don't have the political will, they don't exercise. So this is what we can exploit. So it will be absolutely crucial that NATO will also improve at least its messaging and its exercises on the nuclear level. And I think that although for us here it may seem very controversial, it will be one of those things that will be agreed. And this is where I will end. Thank you very much.
Pass it straight to Ståle. Thank you very much, Wojciech.
Thank you, Carsten. Since I'm representing the Naval College as well as NUPI, I'm going to talk about NATO at sea, the maritime domain mostly. I'm going to take a look at the NATO standing forces, but I'm also going to try to put or make a snapshot of the global naval situation, so to speak. This is the naval standing forces, acronyms: Standing NATO Maritime Group 1. That's the force of escort ships, normally traveling in North Atlantic, and a similar one in the Mediterranean. The last several years, the last decade or more, they have switched rooms, and both of them have gone to the Indian Sea to do the anti-pirate operations and those kind of things. These ones, mine countermeasures group of vessels. All these are standings. Every nation is rotating ships in and out of these groups, and they function both as a standing force, as a tripwire, so to speak, but also as a school where you can learn from the best, and you learn to interact. You maintain interoperability and those kind of things. So what's the status of these things now? This is the so-called sea power triangle, very much used in debates on naval doctrine. Military wartime operations are down here. This one is the diplomatic side. How you use naval forces to send messages to other states. When you deploy an aircraft carrier outside someone's coast, that someone will have to react to it. This one is about maritime security. It's about the constabulary everything, stopping pirates, but also picking up refugees, doing those kind of things. So the last 25 years, I would say, most NATO activity has been in this area, and very little in the war-fighting area. And to the extent they have done war-fighting, they have done so by projecting power from the sea, not fighting battles at sea. And that's a major difference, because when you're projecting power from the sea towards land, then you actually have control on sea. You just use it to do airstrikes or fire cruise missiles or land troops or whatever. And thing is, of course, if you're just doing these things, if you use all your resources on relatively low intensive missions, then you lose the ability to fight wars. Because you need to exercise, you need to train, you need to invest in all this kind of complex expertise that you need to make a ship work in war. This is how SMG-1 looked in August 2007. Pretty good. U.S. cruiser here, the Normandy, air defense ships, several frigates from several allies, and with a tanker that can make sure that the force is able to operate for a long time. Many flags, broad capability. But then all these nations started saving them. So this September 2015, this was SNMG-1. Norwegian frigate, Portuguese frigate, 2 ships. And of course, if you want the coffin, flags on the coffins, then I don't think that the Norwegian flag and the Portuguese flag would deter very much in those settings. So this is the normal state of this force right now. It's worrying to an extent. But then, and this is from the present, they already just ended exercise cold response in Norway this week and last week. We can see that the force has been expended again, but it's Spanish, small Norwegian ships that are just in the force for a brief period of time. So it's still a very small force. There's not much commitment there. The good news there is that this frigate is a British one. And this is the first time since 2010 that Great Britain actually has contributed anything to these forces. So that seems to indicate that at least the Royal Navy is willing to contribute again. This is the mine countermeasure force. And you can see if you take a look at the nations here, it's all the Baltic states and Poland and Germany and Norwegian ships all working together to clear mines in the Baltic. These are old mines. They are clearing mines from the First World War, Second World War, but they are also of course marking the flag. And this is also a very important integration place for NATO forces. These forces are working better, but these ships are kind of unsexy things that Europe used to have more than 300 of. These are the first ships that you cut when you cut the budget. And these are clearing sea mines. A sea mine can blow up a big ship. It can sink a carrier. It's cheap. You can buy a rather simple one for about $3,000. And then you can make them pretty advanced. If you have the ability to lay mines, it will take a lot of effort to clear them up again. So if someone would, for instance, deny Europe reinforcements from the US, or then you just put some mines in Rotterdam, in Antwerp, and in Hamburg, and it will take a long time to clear them. And these capabilities are thus very important, but they have been given very little emphasis in the last several decades. This is the navies of the 6 North Sea countries. As you can see, in 1990, Cold War ended, 185 ships. I'm not going into detail. These are perhaps the most important classes or categories of ships. And now we have 198. So it's sinking. And just since 2000, it's been sinking with about a third. And it's a loss of capability, quite a huge one. And we tend to paint Russia very strong and tall. These states, Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, and UK, has a population 50 million more than Russia. They have a GDP that is about 3 times that of Russia. So perhaps they should be able to balance Russian capability, and I will show that to some extent that they already do. But this is a much weaker force than just in 2000. This is one of the, these are quite rather big ships. These are not counted. In Northern Europe, in the same countries, we had some 120 of these in 1990. Now there's 12 left. So it's a huge reduction. We're about 90% scrapped. This is a German submarine. This is one of the best conventional submarines in the world. Type 212. Very advanced. And Germany has 6 of them. These are probably, this is superb technology, but it doesn't matter really, because the German Navy, they have 6. They have the crew to man 1. All the remaining 5, they don't have a crew to man them. It takes many, many years to educate a crew for a submarine like this. And that is the situation in all these classes. Very low readiness, very low level of manning, simply. So in order to save money, we still have a huge structure. A lot of ships, a lot of brigades, a lot of divisions, much more divisions and brigades than Russia do. But in every one of them, we have lowered the number of people. All of them lack specialized personnel with specialized training, and we lack ammunition, we lack spare parts and all that. That means that what you mentioned a number of brigades. Actually, the Russian army in itself is only 230,000 men. Russian ground force is 300,000. But what they have managed is to raise the readiness of them to make them actually work. Europe, not counting Turkey, but counting all the EU countries and remaining NATO countries, has 144 brigades. But the readiness is extremely low. So even if you can get 30,000 up with high readiness quickly, then for the rest, it will take months and years to get them up on that. So we're using our money wrongly. Yeah. This is the great new thing for the Royal Navy. 2 carriers being built right now. Extremely expensive ships, very capable. But the Royal Navy, they lack 4,000 men to man them. That means that these ships will be manned by about a third of the actual crew that you would need in a combat situation. And the Royal Navy can't afford to buy enough F-35s to use them either. So they have bought these 2 carriers, but only 24 of these aircraft. These can take about 48 each. So you'll get 2 very nice ships with a very little ability to use them for something meaningful, right? This is a typical situation in the West right now. Russia is not the Soviet Union. There's 407 ships, same classes. Now they have 128. Most of them are old. But the Russian is building and investing a lot in new ships right now, and investing a lot in repairing old ships and doing maintenance on them. And this one is the most important class, Borei class, SSBN. This is a strategic submarine. This is Russia's guarantee against deterrence. This is the second strike capability, the one that is able to launch 160 nuclear bombs against anyone that tries to launch anything against Russia. They're building 8 like this, extremely expensive things. Last week this week it was announced that one of these is going to launch 16 missiles in one salvo as a demonstration very soon. So this is what the Russian Navy has prioritized. This is what the US will be debating on the Ohio class, and the UK is debating on the Trident class. Are they going to renew it or not? But Russia has already taken the decision and implemented it. That means that there has been little money for other things. But this one is the largest warship built in the Second World War that is not an aircraft carrier. This is a battle cruiser, Pyotr Veliki. There used to be 4 of them. We thought 3 of them were gone. 2 of them actually are. But the third one, Nakhmikov, has been pulled into the yard and will emerge in a couple of years with a huge number of very new and very advanced missiles. This ship alone will have 500 missiles against air threats. It can dominate a huge area. If you place this one in Skagerrak, for instance, it will dominate the whole of Northern Europe with its radars. Very capable ships. This is what the Russians are discussing building to escort these ones. If Russia goes for this, then they will go for something that is symbolizing a great power thing, something that they can sail the seas and show the flags and do intervention. Extremely expensive things, hard to operate. Just to show the symbolism, this is exactly 1 meter longer than the Gerald 4 that the US is building right now. So it's, okay, we had the largest carrier in the world. We have 1, but it's the largest, right? So it's, what worries me much more is if they are continuing to build these sweet ships. These ones are not in the table I showed you because they're too small. It's just 970 tons. Tactical thing, we thought, until this happened. And These ships are the smallest ships yet to launch long-range cruise missiles. So these are the ships that launched 26 missiles against Syria from the Caspian Sea. And that is extremely worrying, because they are equipping all the ships with those kind of missiles. This one, it's a family of missiles. Some of them have shorter range, some are long. This one is 2,500 kilometers, which means that from the Murmansk harbor, it could reach us right here, right now, if they wanted to. Of course, this is capability that the US, the UK, France have had for a long time, but now the Russians have it, and in vast quantities. And they're replacing this one. This is a Grisha. It's a tactical thing. It's an old-fashioned submarine chaser. To secure a small area against submarines. And of course, this one is can have a strategic effect. And this is a change. This is a real game changer in naval thinking. The Russians are much more creative than we are right now, and they're much better at implementing things. They're taking decisions, actually implementing them, thinking new thoughts. This one is coming in numbers, nice frigates, conventional. These ones too. All the conventional submarines will get the ability to fire cruise missiles. This one is actually a Coast Guard ship to give to the Russian Coast Guard, but this one, these are also cells in which you can put the cruise missiles. Even in a Coast Guard ship, very cheap ship, you can put very advanced cruise missiles. This is serious. This one, you can take the same thing, put them into a standard commercial container, and you can fire it from anywhere. I used to joke that I would like to have one of those on a ski box in my sub, but my wife won't allow me. And this is an Oscar class guided cruise missile submarine. This is a sister of the Kursk, which sank many years ago. These were built to stop American carriers from going through the gear gap, which you can see over there, right? Greenland, Iceland, UK. So that they gave them 24 big missiles, each weighing 7 tons, designed to take out the carrier. Now they have decided to replace or to rebuild these ships. We expected all of them to disappear because they are quite old. And it's costly to repair them. But now the decision is to take all these classes, or most of the vessels inside all these classes, and to extend their life period for 20 years, which means that the number of nuclear-propelled Russian submarines will be about 3 times higher than we expected just a few years ago, almost 40 against 12. And one of these, then, when rebuilt, will not have 24 missiles. It will have 72 or 96. That means that one of them will be able to fire at least 72 cruise missiles. From the middle of the Norwegian Sea, it can reach all of Northern Europe. It can take out all the harbors. It can attack all the airfields. And it changes the whole situation. Impressive. This is the so-called bastion defense, much discussed, at least in naval environment in Norway today. They are exercising this all the time now. This is a defensive thing. If Russia should have a conflict in here in Baltic or with NATO in the south, then what they would like to do is to protect their SSB, the strategic submarines, the expensive arrays that I show you. And they want to close that gap, so no one can go in and attack them. Of course, for us, the problem is that we will be behind these Russian defensive lines. But this is what the main reason for the North Sea Northern Fleet is. All right, U.S. then. You should think of the U.S. as huge and completely dominating a sea. And of course, if you're the world power, you decide the world order, so to speak, then you need to control all these blue areas on that map. You need to control the global commons, Pacific, the Atlantic. The one state who managed to do that will always be the one that more or less is able to dictate the world order. now that capability is dwindling, and most of it is moved to the south to the Pacific. This is the U.S. Marine Corps. This is the sea-basing concept, and almost all the key capabilities here, they are deployed at Guam over there, like behind the Philippines. It will take them 60 days to sail to Northern Europe. Which means that if you trust the Royal Marines to really come, then you will have to provide these things yourself, or they will have to change their landing concept. I don't think they're very eager to do that. This is how it's done. Now, China should be discussed when we discuss naval matters, because the U.S. is challenged by China. First and foremost, the situation in South China Sea, East China Sea is much more important, I think, to the U.S. strategic thinkers than the situation in Crimea, for instance. This is a real expansion. China is building massively. They are demanding a huge part of the South China Sea, and they are building these islands. This is Fiery Cross Reef. They are building 7 like this. A small thing becoming a big thing when a 3,000-meter runway placed the bombers and all that. The point of showing this is that if you are declaring a territorial zone around this, which the Chinese says to do, then you challenge the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. And then you try to change the world order, so to speak. So this is very, very serious, and this is what the U.S. Navy is worried about. This is what the Chinese are building. Of these classes, they have built 83 ships in 30 years, in 6 years. A warship normally lasts for about 30 years, so you can multiply it with 5, and if they keep up this speed, then they will have more than 400 warships of these classes. Point is here, if you take the French and the British Navy, these are the 2 largest and best navies in Europe. They have 82 ships of these classes. So in 6 years, the Chinese have actually built more ships than both the French and British already have in their fleets combined. This is serious. This is a challenge so that the U.S. need to prioritize. Therefore, to trust large-scale U.S. reinforcement to a Europe that is 5 times as rich as Russia is unrealistic. You can't expect it. They have to prioritize somewhere else. Yeah. Just to say a little bit, 2 things about the Russian army as well. It's not that large. These are different kinds of brigades. This is the armor thing, mechanized, airborne, marines. In addition, they have artillery and a lot of other support things. Point is, in the Western District, then, there's 24. Poland has 14 alone. Europe has many, many more than this. So the problem is not the size of the Russian forces close to our border. The problem is their willingness to use it, and the part of these forces are in very high readiness and very usable. And those are these forces. They don't belong to the army. The airborne forces outside the army, 35,000 men, expanding now up to 50,000 and 75,000. They're very useful. They are used a lot in the Ukraine, and they are used a lot in to force protection in Syria. These are the people who fight Russia's wars, and also the marine units are in the same level. So part of the army is also being lifted up, and worrying thing that it is concentrated into tank armies again. A tank army, like we discussed, what is a substantial force. Tank army is a thing from the Cold War, or in from the Blitzkrieg. It's a hugely mechanized, heavily armored force that can break through the defenses, spread out around and destroy the hind areas. So if you want to achieve something very quickly, then use a tank army. So one of these tank armies consists of about 6 or 8 of these being re-raised in Western Russia now. They will have more than 600 tanks, modern tanks. The whole German army have 300 tanks, which shows that there is, okay, Europe has a lot of, much richer than Russia, has much larger forces, but they have perhaps the wrong kind of forces and the wrong kind of readiness. And this is to some extent NATO's own fault. Because when we were struggling in Afghanistan, especially around 2006, 2007, then advice from NATO was, oh, get rid of all the tanks, they're old-fashioned, obsolete things. Oh, we want infantry, light infantry. So now we have light infantry, but we have very few tanks. And NATO even said, oh, get rid of all the submarines, they're old-fashioned, we don't need them. So now we're very short of submarines. So NATO is not in kind of the fountain of wisdom in all respects. It's always focused on the task of the day. NATO is not very good at long-term planning. That's where I end. Thank you.
Lovely, Ståle. Thank you for a nice slideshow. It always makes it easier to pay attention when you have nice pictures to look at. Right, perfect. Thank you again to all three of you. A bit different perspectives. Lots of worrying signs to pick up on. I would maybe invite the panel to, if you want to comment on each other somehow, anything, before we open the floor. You are welcome to do so. If not, yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's see if anyone right away would like to ask something. We'll start with you. Nina's next, and then just hold on a second. You get the microphone, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Eric. I work at Pluricourts at the University of Oslo. I had a question for Ringsmose. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much. My question was on, I was a bit confused on what exactly NATO is supposed to be deterring, because I think, if I understood you correctly, you talked about deterring major conflict against NATO from the part of Russia. And then I think deterrence by punishment makes a lot of sense. But the favorite strategy of some of the current so-called revisionist powers like Russia in Crimea and China in the South China Seas and the East China Seas has been more smaller operations. In terms of Crimea, it was a small, quick operation. In terms of the South China Seas, it's these small, slow operations where they slowly gain power. So so if we were to take the example of some kind of operation against the Baltic states, and Russia doesn't go all in, but just tries to take a slice of Estonia, for example, then I think deterrence by denial makes a bit more sense, at least because deterrence by punishment doesn't seem credible at all. So I just wondered if you could comment on that, if you would like. And also, if I could squeeze in a second question, just very quickly. Could you also talk about, is there firm division between deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial? Because for example, in deterrence by denial, there seems to be a lot of punishment. So, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Erik. Good questions, Jens.
Okay, thank you very much. Good question. Deterring what? I think if you look at the Baltic states, it's a power vacuum. There's no military power there, right? We have 16 air police, fighter jets, 18 fighter jets policing small, not very capable armies and so on. So it's a power vacuum. But I think that NATO, and of course that invites thinking about could we, how could we? But I think definitely that NATO should deter against taking a slice. That would be definitely a red line for NATO. And I think actually NATO members did a quite good job in sending that message. Joe Biden was in the Baltic states very quickly arguing that Article 5 is in place and solemn and we will defend and so on. So I think that NATO should absolutely deter against that. When it comes to the balance between deterrence by denial and punishment, I think if you look at the Cold War, you had both, right? You're putting up forces, preparing yourself to defend and persuading your opponent that you're building a wall that is so high that you shouldn't even try. But at the same time, you had deterrence by punishment because you have nuclear forces and so on. And during the Cold War, the pendulum swung back and forth between that. During the 50s, you had massive retaliation, which was basically deterrence primarily by punishment. Then you had flexible response swinging towards something that was closer to deterrence by denial. So I think these ideal types, and at the same, I mean, here in Norway, I was invited to Trondheim a few weeks ago to give an outsider perspective on the Forsvarschefens Fagmilitære Råd, FMR. And to me, that was all about deterrence by denial. It was by setting up forces in the particular, mainly in northern Norway, and persuading an opponent not even to try. That was not about deterrence by punishment. And I think that's a Norwegian way of thinking, and it reflects a Norwegian strategic culture, which is very different from a Danish strategic culture. And that was what I'm trying to say with the anecdote. We don't believe in that, because we simply think that Denmark is up for grabs. Whoever wants any major power could take it like that. So we need to rely on deterrence by punishment.
I can add 2 sentences. I think that you're right that there is no clear-cut boundary between deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment, especially when we are thinking about the Baltic states region. And how I assess the thing, I think that feasible thing is to deter by punishment, in this sense that if Russia decided to go for this limited goals strategy and cut out the 4 kilometers square of Estonia, for example, then you have the fierce resistance on the national level. So this is not in the NATO context, because we know that there is no political will to have a credible NATO deterrence by denial, which would require the RAND Corporation estimates that 7 brigades permanently based in Baltic states and Poland, for example, right? So if we cannot have it in the NATO format, so at least we need to increase the costs on the national level and give time for NATO to react and to, and this is what we are doing now. We are trying to send the message that NATO will react, right? So that there will be political will, even it will be costly, and even if there will be a risk of escalation up to the nuclear level, that if we are able to escalate on all the levels, then we will be credible. So this is the structure that how I see it, that we can send a signal to Russians to influence their calculations that obviously they could count that NATO will not react, but they will not be sure. That could count that it will be more difficult to react if there is the escalation, but they won't be sure. So this is how this deterrence probably should work these days.
Dole, would you like to add a sentence on this?
Some years ago, we had a debate in Norway about the size of the army, and General Mood he declared that the Norwegian army, that's 1 brigade now, is able to defend a small part of Oslo. So if you want to occupy Estonia is a small country, but to occupy Kosovo, which is also a very small country, we use 60,000 men, which is about 12 brigades. It's not easy, even if you're Russian, to occupy an area that is hostile. So if you have a large home guard in such an area, for instance, then you would have to calculate. You get a lot of people home in coffins. I actually believe in also in that kind of low-tech force with a high motivation that could be very strong deterrent in that kind of situation. And that is what the Finns also believes, for instance. So there's many different options. And to occupy an area efficiently, you need a much, much larger force than Russia already has. And if Russia wants to use all its forces in one place, what are they going to do with all the borders? I mean, they have the largest concentration of the Russian army is in the east, in Khabarovsk. And then they have a huge concentration in the south because they have problems with those borders as well. So I don't think that an invasion with the aim of occupying is realistic at all. I think it could be an aim that is motivated with some kind of will to denial of some kind of things. Is much more likely.
Before I pass on to Nina, his next question, I would like to follow on exactly that point. Do you, the two other panels, do you agree that are we talking about tanks across the border? You said that's not likely. Are you agree? Is that the kind of scenario that we need to deter against some kind of a borderline military gunboat diplomacy, imposing political will through military means? Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on your perspective. What the main threat is?
How I see it, that is that when we look at all levels of what is going on, that Russia revealed the capability of escalating up to the nuclear level, and it was the area where they were focused on in recent years. They rebuilt the infrastructure, and this is probably what also influenced their behavior, that they know that they can in a credible way threaten the escalation up to the nuclear level, and the West is not prepared for this. But it can well work also on other conventional levels. If the West is unable to respond to Russia's capabilities, if NATO is not able, even with this time reaction gap, is not able to deliver on different levels of escalation, and Russia is free to exploit this regional superiority, definitely it does not need to translate into the offensive operation, but it will translate into coercion and blackmail, and it will be used just like we can see, Russia's intervention in Syria, where there are conflicting interests, and it is not only taking place in Syria, but Russia from the day one started to provoke Turkey, with which it had perfect bilateral relations, but when the strategic goals and geopolitical goals are at stake, it starts to treat Turkey as a NATO member. It escalates, it provokes, and it sends signals at the same time by organizing different exercises and raising the readiness of troops, that if there is, Russia-Turkey, Russia-NATO conflict, the escalation can quickly move to the Baltic States region, where NATO will not be able to respond in a credible way. So this is the first level, that with revanchist Russia and trying to regain some influence in the world, we also need to have the credibility of the credible means to react on all escalation levels, to be able just to operate outside our territory. But again, it is just like, discussion very much political and very much associated to our geopolitical location as well. What we believe or what we don't believe. But when you look into conventional deterrence, we are just not there. We don't have the credible conventional deterrence yet, and it can open the way for aggressive behavior.
I think I agree with you, Ståle, that there's not really a huge military threat from Russia. If I was in the Kremlin, I would be much more worried about my borders to the east and to the south. Actually, the borders to the west are the most peaceful of all. And I don't think that Russia truly see the West as a major threat. I would be much more worried about China and what's going on in the south, in the belly of Russia. So I think the what we should be more worried about, and which is really difficult to do, is a political pressure. And what Russia is looking for is splitting NATO, splitting the EU, splitting the West. And I think that is much more worrying. And I think that the reason that it's worrying has to do with the fact that NATO is split by differing threat perceptions, very much so. And it's affecting everything that's going on in NATO, these differing threat perceptions. You have one group of countries very focused on the east, another group focusing on the south, migration problems. Then you have a third group of countries still thinking that the next new thing will be a new Afghanistan or a new Iraq, Denmark, the UK, to some extent the US. And then you have a number of countries who think that they don't feel threatened, but they think that NATO is important. So I think that what should worry us. is that the Russia should somehow be able to take advantage of that split that's already there.
Divide and rule. Yep. Nina, you've been patient. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. You partly stole my question, Karsten, but I also want to go back to what actually a security threat is. It's a combination of capabilities and also intention, right? So we talked a bit about the scenarios here. And now, Ståle, you gave us a very gloomy picture about Europe's and our allied access to capabilities, whereas our sort of main enemies, Russia and China as it is, are rebuilding theirs, right? So I was wondering then about what would be Russia's then or China's intentions here? You partly answered it, but still again, I would like to push a bit further on that. Then secondly, given the Ståle, you also said that why should the US pay for Europe's security when Europe is so rich? Well, I think if you go to European capitals, they will tell a different story. So what are the prospects, according to you, I can ask that for all three of you, for the NATO summit coming up, as well as the EU summit and the White Book on Defense to sort of manage to get the people on board spending more money on defense in this very difficult situation? Thank you.
I think that what the Russians and the Chinese are very clear on what they want. They've said so many times they want new rules or no rules. Putin said in Sochi in 2014. I think they want to be recognized as someone that is part of the great power concept they want to put in this multi-power system, multipolar system. They want to be to have influence on how the world is ruled, so to speak. China wants to change some of the law of the sea. They want territorial control over some areas, and so on and so on. Europe spends more than 2.5 times as much on defense as Russia does. Europe is mired down in some kind of new public management swamp that makes sure that you don't get any military readiness. You get a lot of very strange ways to use your money. Simply, I mean, a lot of very silly things have been decided, and they don't have to spend much more, a little bit more, but then they have to have to focus on things that readiness are more important than what you actually buy. NATO, for instance, has put up this target, 2% of the GDP. That's one target, but another target that is more important for many is that you need to spend at least 20% of your budget in investment. So that's what the Germans have done then. They'll try to do when they buy all these submarines and can't man them. So you buy a lot of stuff and you can't man them. And we are in exactly the same position now. We are going to buy a lot of stuff that we are not able to use properly. So you have these kind of scoreboards that you relate to, and instead of focusing on actually what kind of capability do we actually need and do it properly, then we are doing a lot of facade building, simply. But I agree very much with Jens that it's also a question of trust. Even if the total European capability is much larger than Russians or anyone's in the neighborhood, then if there's a crisis and you only got 100 aircraft, would you really send them abroad? For instance, Great Britain right now has about 100 operational fighter aircraft. In a real crisis, would they really send them away?
Can I just add something to the burden question issue? I think what we've seen since Wales is actually that cuts in defense spending have somewhat stopped. And there are even countries that are spending slightly more on defense in NATO. But not a lot of countries and not a lot of more spending. But there are good signs there, if you think that spending more is a good thing. I don't think that it will go much further, though, because if you look at NATO history, twice in the history of NATO did the Europeans actually really spend more. That was during the early 50s, in the late 70s, early 80s. And what happened both both instances was that the Americans put a lot of pressure on the Europeans, told them that, well, if you want a security guarantee, you need to step up and you need to spend right now. At the same time, the Europeans actually felt threatened. Early 50s, the war scare, North Korea, and so on. Late 70s, the second Cold War. So you need those two things in place for the Europeans to spend more, I believe. True, really credible American pressure, and feeling, threatening, being scared by someone ugly. And I don't think that's going to happen right now. I don't think the American pressure is really, really tough on Europe. It has, to some extent, been ritualized. The Europeans go to annual reviews in Brussels, and they spanked, and then they go back and let's cut some more. It's become a ritual. And I don't think that the Europeans are really, well, some Europeans are really scared of Russia, but most Europeans intelligence services, they tell you that there's no risk of a military attack.
I will just refer to this, what we are afraid of, or what should we be afraid of in the context of what is going on in China and in Russia. It is, I think, there is the consensus in analysts' world that the primary goal is to create a multipolar world, right? Again, if we think what is possible, if we look at the potential of China and Russia, we know that in this sense that we could see in the naval capabilities that they will be probably, at least Russia definitely will not be a global power, but will be able to achieve its goals in its vicinity. The same with China. The priority is South China Sea, and their goals are so clear there, and they are so openly stated that you cannot exclude that they will go for a military scenario if they first find that the balance is in their favor, and then that they achieve what they wanted to achieve through this. So if we go back to Europe and to Russia, which still looks, although we are NATO and EU member states, if you look at some Russian briefings, you know, how they are afraid of NATO or US presence in the region, how they are afraid of the missile defense, although it definitely does not alter the strategic balance, but it changes the thinking, US thinking on the region. So it somehow slips out of this Russian perception that this is the buffer zone, right? That the American security guarantees to the region can be more credible than they used to be in previously. So this is why they so ferociously protest against the presence of missile defense elements in Poland. So we know two things, that now they are ready to use force if NATO or EU or there are no other transatlantic structures that would like to expand or enlarge to post-Soviet space. They would use force to block it. And we can be pretty confident that there won't be any further enlargement. And the second thing is that we don't know how they will react to strengthening of the eastern flank, of the changed status of the former Warsaw Pact countries. So we still try to stay under the threshold of this NATO-Russia Founding Act. But again, we cannot be sure whether all this messaging that they have put in place and capabilities and exercises, all those things, and accusation of the West that they are encircled by NATO and they feel threatened, whether they will really need something that will provoke it and will go over this threshold, or whether they just use it as a pretext for anything, anyway, exploiting it for their benefit. So this is something that we can discuss, but this is what we don't know.
Thank you. There's a gentleman in the middle here.
Thank you. My name is Jørn Bue. I spent 25 years in the Norwegian Armed Forces, one of them here at NUPI as a military research fellow, and 3 years in Moscow as the Norwegian Defense Attaché. And I have one comment and one question. And my comment goes basically to Jens' PhD and your explanation of the difference between Denmark and Norway. And obviously I'm on thin ice, but the general that commanded Weserübung, General Falkenhorst, in his report after the war, he said that the defense of Norway was 90% geography and 10% government, military, and people. The geography solved its task, the government, the military, and the people didn't. And that might be a difference between Denmark and Norway if you look at how you think. So then my question goes to the sort of threats towards NATO. You have focused a lot on Russia, which obviously is very relevant, and I can understand that. But I guess you're also talking about at least 2 other threats, which still is relevant. It's the terrorist threat, and you also have the threat from criminal organizations. And I think one of the challenges is what's a threat from a state, what's terrorist, and what's criminal is often hard to see. And if you study the Gerasimov doctrine, you see that it's a mixture, or it's basically a symphony of different kind of tools you can use. And the military tools are very late in the doctrine, and the sort of ambition, I think, is to achieve goals basically without using military force. And how is NATO prepared to meet all those other challenges that is in that doctrine that could be used by terrorists, criminals, or foreign states, or other states? Thank you.
If I may add, should NATO prepare for that, maybe? Please, who wants to start?
Very quickly, I will say that achieving goals without using force, when it is, of course, feasible, where they could do this, but there was a credible force behind their backs, right, in Ukraine. So if this scenario did not work, they could also go with this scenario that they were preparing, that okay, we are ready to go and carve Novorossiya, and the forces were there. So you had to treat this scenario as also possible. So this is mainly making it short about the hybrid warfare. The hybrid warfare is not a warfare for itself. It's the type of warfare that usually is employed together with conventional warfare. But if it works fine without conventional means, so even better, right? Yeah.
To me, hybrid warfare and the Gerasimov doctrine is not really about warfare. It's about very heavy-handed, full-spectrum politics in a sense that you use everything that might actually work in order to change the other guy's will to do something. And in the discussions in Norway, well, as you know, it's been pointed out that, okay, in that kind of situation, we need NATO to activate Article 5. And I think that is something that should be debated. When should NATO actually go in such a situation and declare that, okay, stop, it stops here, and so forth. And I think that could be a useful role for NATO. But of course, that would also depend on all the nations agreeing here, because when you deploy all these full-spectrum politics strategies, then those states doesn't necessarily agree on everything. So I think perhaps it will be difficult for NATO to get all its interests and all its different threat perceptions in line for that. But I think that would be, at least for many states, that would be a kind of relief.
Can I just comment on your comment? I very much agree that geography is very, very different. And strategic culture is shaped by geography and history. And clearly Denmark and Norway's geography is very, very different. We invite every power to invade us because it's the easiest country in the world to invade, more or less. And then history. Our strategic history is one of defeats. We were defeated in 1864. We were defeated during the Second World War easily, and we never really fought. Right? Your history is very different. One of your defining historical moments was the Second World War. You actually fought. We didn't, and you fought for a while. And some even argue that you could have kicked out the Germans if it hadn't been the French and the British running off. So some argue that. I've heard it. So I'm just saying we have different defining historical moments and geography, and I think that shapes our strategic culture. Our strategic culture in Denmark is one of being a small state. I'm not sure it's the same thing here. In Trondheim, people were talking about being a middle power. I don't know if that's true, but
At least we're not the Middle Kingdom. Huh?
And very briefly, coming back to the southern threat, it's it's quite clear now. You can see, because of Syria that I mentioned, that southern and eastern threats, just like they again, there is no clear cut division. If you want to deal effectively with the ISIS in Syria, so Russians now tell you, okay, so let's talk and let's negotiate, remove the sanctions and make some further concessions. Some states would be willing to this, but generally you can see that everybody in NATO now understands that this is not time for bigger concessions, even with this huge crisis with the refugees, and you need to strengthen the southern flank also through NATO-EU cooperation. Ironically, now 2 southern states, Turkey and Cyprus, are blocking this cooperation. You could definitely get more from the cooperation of EU and NATO naval missions, not only controlling what the influx of refugees, but also controlling the Russian activities, which are very provocative in the Eastern Mediterranean. So definitely there is a difference of threat perception, but I can see that after almost 2 years after the summit in Wales, it is not getting bigger, but rather the gap is narrowing.
Thank you. 2 more questions. First, it's a lady there.
Hello, I'm Sofia Balanchivadze, First Secretary of the Georgian Embassy to Norway. I have first of all, thank you for very interesting presentations. I have rather a comment to Mr. Lawrence's presentation rather than a question. It's regarding when we talk about Russia, that clearly demonstrates that it doesn't want to let go the ex-Soviet countries, which are already quite a longer period independent. We should not forget about the Georgian case. Unfortunately, Ukraine was not the first country. Soon after Bucharest Summit in 2008, there was a Russian-Georgian war in August of 2008. And almost more than 7 years have passed, but we still have occupation. 20% of our territories are occupied by Russian troops, and the occupation line is quite long, and there is a creeping annexation on the Georgian territories. So unfortunately, we should not forget that Ukraine wasn't the first case. It started with Georgia, and unfortunately, it continued. We say that it is continued. So, yeah, thank you. I just wanted.
Thank you for that reminder. It's certainly been reread as a historical lesson now, I think, among many experts. Next is Ida Maria from FFI. Just wait for microphone over there. Sorry, IFS. I know very well where you work. Institute for Defense Studies.
Well, first of all, thank you for very interesting presentations. Something has been said about the bright side of developing and testing the VJTF. So I really would like to hear the panel elaborate on the practical and political impediments to force generation and the rapid reaction of the VJTF. And also I would like you to elaborate on how NATO should balance between force speed and weight, the need for follow-on forces and so on to achieve effective deterrence. And the final question, I'd like to hear your views on the role of technological developments in enabling deterrence by punishment. Thank you.
Each question could be a PhD itself. Thank you for giving such an easy task for the last. But that will be the last round then. 3 last questions. You can pick. You don't have to answer each one of them. But the last of you should make sure that you answer the question which has not been answered. To put it that way. Why don't we do since it's the final round also, I think we'll do the opposite way, if you don't mind. Jens, very eager there. I think we'll start with Ståle, and you will, Jens, will have the final last word. Thank you. Okay, if you have to think, I'll pass it back to Jens. Okay.
Okay, I'm ready
Perfect.
to answer the question on technical things and deterrence by punishment. This was exactly the thinking of France in 1939, 1940, when they were thinking, okay, how do we react if Germans are ready to deploy 200 divisions and we are unable to match it? Maybe we will go with some technological things and we will solve this problem. Before they solved this problem, there was the World War II in the full scale, and it did not change anything. And these days, I think that again, even if you have technical capabilities of hitting your adversary deep in the territory, even if you have the so-called plausible deniability, that the adversary will not know whether it was you or somebody else. The reality is pretty simple and dramatic, that there is the risk of escalation up to the nuclear level, and even with new weapons, it could easily escalate to this level, and you would need to be prepared for this. Political and technical impediments of the deployment of VJTF, they are pretty obvious and well known. There is the political decision-making process in NATO, which is definitely not perfect, and it takes time. There have been some attempts to improve it, and they managed to improve it by delegating some authority to Supreme Commander Europe, Secure, so he will be able to put VJTF on alert and to ask troops to get ready and prepare, waiting for the political decision to deploy them, which will shorten the reaction time, and this is a good, definitely a good thing. But again, this is the alliance of sovereign states, and the sovereign states do not want to give up their authority, their decision on the deployment, and we won't solve this problem probably.
Okay, I'll stick to the VJTF NRF question, and I think there will be at least 3 major problems. One has to do with what Jake already said, that and it has to do with the problem that always taunted the NRF, that it has never been really been put to use, because allies couldn't agree amongst themselves whether to use it or not. And it has to do with the fact that the NRF was born as a vehicle that could really do 2 things: transform NATO forces and then be a deployable tool. And allies could never agree amongst themselves whether it was only supposed to be a vehicle for transformation, as the French thought, or that maybe perhaps we should actually also make use of it, for instance, in Afghanistan, as the British, to some extent, Danes, the US also believed. So that's one thing, and now the NRF has come into a new, and the VJTF into a new era, where Article 5 and regional Europe is once again playing a role. And what you see now is actually, it's interesting that suddenly the NRF are being thought of and perceived of as something that has to do with Article 5 and territorial defense. That's the first time ever. From when it was born in 2002-3, it was always about transformation and deploying forces out of area. Now it has to do with what is in vogue, Article 5. So I think that will be a major problem. Then what always taunted the NRF as well, contributions. Nations have been unwilling to contribute the forces that are really needed. So already in 2008 or 9, SACEUR actually considered closing down the NRF. Political masters wouldn't allow him to do it, but he actually argued that the NRF needed to be closed down because nations were not contributing enough forces, and therefore it was of no use. So, and then lastly, I think turning the NRF and the VJTF into a vehicle for Article 5 and collective defense will make it incredibly expensive. And I think that will be something that nations will think hard about. And once Mr. Putin and the Russians behave slightly better, I'm pretty sure that the Belgians, the Dutch, the Danes, they can think of something better to spend their money on than actually manning the VJTF. That would be my guess.
Okay, Ståle, last round to you.
Well, yeah. I contemplated speed versus weight. Yes. Russia has gone for both, but speed first. And I think that is probably if you want to guarantee your member states, then you need speed first. But you will also need the weight. So you need to do both in a sense. But speed is probably the most important if you have to choose. Technological solutions, of course. I think we are in the middle of what in the 1990s we call revolutions in military affairs right now, and it's going to change military systems and institutions tremendously the next 10 years. I guess you have all seen these small lawn movers moving peacefully around the lawn, cutting things, and then it moves back again to its little house and links up with a battery and gets charged and so on. Okay, that's an autonomous system, right? So it's a robot that decides for himself where to go and all that. And with developments both in electronic warfare, especially seen now in the Ukraine. And with the developments of unmanned aerial vehicles, other kinds of remotely controlled systems, the combination of those the logical answer is to create more autonomous systems and present us with several very strong ethical dilemmas, I think. But I think they will be coming anyway, all around. We already see many military autonomous systems in operations in Israel, South Korea, elsewhere. But I try to study the development in the 19th century, where technology we're changing all the time. I studied navies. I studied the Danish Navy and the Swedish Navy. And the Danish Navy, they said, okay, this creates a lot of uncertainty. So we go for the known thing, and then we'll keep our organization. So when the war you didn't lose in 1848, then the Danish Navy were really prepared for that, and because it had a very organized and well-functioning system that the Prussians and Austrians weren't able to, or the Prussians and the rebels weren't able to challenge it. But then again, Swedes they had more industry. They followed the other thing. They ran after one innovation after the other. And they ended up with a navy that was a composition of freaks, all prototypes. And nothing could work together with the other things, and so it was kind of chaotic. So there's the risks both ways here. If you are in technological forerunner, then you risk that it will perhaps destroy your organization, or you will go for a technology that is met by another technology very quickly. And you invest a lot of money in that. For instance, if you go for stealth now, then what will happen within radars and electronic ESM and those kind of things within the next couple of decades? We don't know. Risk. But if you're too slow, then you risk being someone else finds a really smart way to destroy you or neutralize you. So it's impossible to answer the question, but it's a very interesting one, I think.
As you can see, there are lots of topics. We could have seminars every day. But thank you so much to the panel. Thank you to all of you who came and asked good questions. Let me remind you, the next seminar will be April 6th, Christopher Coker, London School of Economics, will speak. Jeffrey Larson, NATO Defense College, and Henrik Bratenbach from the Center for Defense Studies in Copenhagen will also be there. So that'll be also a good panel, looking a little bit more into the future, a little more concretely on the challenges in Warsaw. Thanks again, and let's all give a big hand to the panel.